Bradley grabbed the heavy electromagnetic tongs, ready to toss the rusted, mud-caked sword into the scrap bin like a piece of garbage. He was a top-tier military tech specialist, and the frail old woman standing across the table was insulting his billion-dollar armory with this wet junk. She didn't flinch. "You look at this and see ruin," she whispered quietly. Bradley smirked and applied a single drop of cleaning solvent to the blade. But as he wiped the grime away, the base's billion-dollar scanning archway began to scream. The rust retracted, revealing impossible, glowing hexagonal scales. His entire digital world violently shut down. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? Drop your location in the comments below. If you want stories about ancient secrets the modern world tried to bury, hit subscribe. You won't regret it. Because when the military base initiated a lethal thermal lockdown to destroy the artifact, the glowing sword didn't just survive. It revealed a perfectly preserved, mid-century military dog tag sealed inside its ancient hilt, whose name was stamped on it. And what did it prove they'd done? The intake room at the Fort Harrison Historical Munitions Annex was not a place for ghosts, memories, or sentimental fairy tales. It was a cathedral of cold, hard data, a fortress of titanium and polished glass where the past was strictly quantified. Specialist Bradley Vance liked it exactly that way. Every morning, he walked through the heavy, interlocking blast doors, his boots squeaking against the pristine white linoleum, holding a digital tablet that contained the microschematics for every modern weapon system known to the armed forces. He was a young man of the digital age, a prodigy trained to recognize carbon fiber stress fractures, drone calibration errors, and thermal optic misalignments. History, to Bradley, was nothing more than a series of outdated blueprints waiting to be digitized, categorized, and promptly forgotten in the bottomless archives of the government servers. His daily routine was a masterclass in modern arrogance. He trusted only what could be measured by a laser or verified by a satellite connection. The first thing every submitted artifact had to pass through was his pride and joy, the archway. It was a massive, softly humming ring of electromagnetic sensors that dominated the center of the room. This archway was designed to map molecular structures in seconds, detecting everything from latent radiation to microscopic explosive residue. It was a marvel of modern engineering, completely infallible in Bradley's eyes. Next to the archway sat his workstation, a fortress of glowing monitors directly tethered to the Department of Defense's Central Historical Database. If an object did not possess a stamped serial number, a registered metallurgical signature, or a scannable barcode, then as far as Bradley's computer was concerned, it simply did not exist. And behind his desk stood rows of heavy, climate-controlled, lead-lined containment cases. They were designed to hold the most unstable modern ordnance, sealing danger away behind 3 inches of bulletproof glass and complex electronic biometric locks. Bradley trusted the locks. He trusted the sensors. He trusted the unblinking eye of the digital world. He certainly did not trust the dusty, rambling stories of elderly civilians walking in off the street clutching family heirlooms. And yet, Evelyn Carter had somehow breached his perfect, sterile sanctuary. She had bypassed the outer perimeter security checkpoints using a legacy pass, a faded, brittle paper document from an era before microchips, which the automated gate scanners had barely managed to recognize. She had carried her burden wrapped in a tattered, oil-stained canvas tarp, stubbornly refusing to let the automated transport drones carry it down the hallway. When she finally unwrapped the object under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of Bradley's intake table, the room itself seemed to reject its presence. It was a sword, heavy, primitive, and reeking of wet earth and oxidized iron. The blade was deeply pitted, the hilt wrapped in what looked like petrified leather, and the pommel cracked from some long-forgotten impact. To Bradley, it was an absolute insult to his perfectly ordered world. It was a piece of junk, likely pulled from a flooded barn or a muddy riverbed. He picked up his tablet, stifling a heavy sigh, ready to log the item as miscellaneous scrap metal. He was eager to clear his table and return to processing the sleek, laser-guided firing components he actually cared about. He tapped his stylus against the glass screen, asking the frail woman for a serial number, a unit designation, a museum registry, anything his beloved database could digest. Evelyn simply stood there, Her spine remained perfectly straight despite the obvious frailty of her age. She wore a simple, faded wool coat and clutched a worn handbag, her pale blue eyes fixed entirely on the ruined weapon resting between them. She offered no numbers. She offered no barcodes. Bradley felt a sharp flicker of annoyance. He was a busy specialist. The towering servers behind him were processing terabytes of modern tactical data, and he was stuck humoring an old woman holding onto a piece of worthless farm scrap. Frustrated, he reached for a pair of heavy electromagnetic tongs, intending to grab the sword, toss it onto the conveyor belt of the automated scanning archway, and let the machines prove its worthlessness once and for all. But as Bradley's hand hovered over the rusted iron, he hesitated. Why did the temperature in the sterile room suddenly feel like it was dropping? And what was the strange, almost imperceptible vibration humming beneath the old woman's quiet confidence? Bradley's fingers wrapped around the thick handles of the electromagnetic tongs, but before the heavy metal clamps could touch the oxidized iron, a sudden, jarring sound shattered the quiet of the intake room. It was not the familiar, polite chirp of an incoming email or a standard logistics update. It was the harsh, throbbing pulse of the red priority beacon mounted high on the wall above his workstation, a light Bradley had only ever seen activated during simulated lockdown drills. He dropped the tongs, the metal clattering loudly against the sterile table, and spun toward his glowing monitors. The standard blue and green displays of his inventory system had vanished. In their place, a solid black screen dominated the array, displaying a single, glowing string of amber text. It was an override command, initiating a direct, secure handshake with the highest levels of the military command structure. Someone, somewhere far above his pay grade, was actively monitoring this specific room. His secure radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence with the breathless voice of the installation commander. The voice was tight, stripped of its usual bureaucratic calm, demanding to know the exact status of the civilian visitor and the uncatalogued artifact she had brought through the perimeter gates. The commander did not casually ask about a piece of scrap metal. He specifically ordered Bradley, under threat of immediate court-martial, not to subject the item to any standard electromagnetic scanning, chemical analysis, or automated transport. The sheer panic in the senior officer's voice was unmistakable. A moment later, heavy boot steps began echoing from the long corridor outside, the distinct, rhythmic thud of a heavily armed rapid response security team moving in double time toward his exact location. Bradley stared at the cracked, filthy sword resting harmlessly on the velvet cloth. His mind raced, struggling to bridge the gap between his absolute certainty that this was a worthless piece of junk and the terrifying reality that the entire military hierarchy was suddenly mobilizing to secure it. He looked back at Evelyn Carter. She had not moved, nor had she even blinked at the flashing red lights and the sound of approaching soldiers. She merely rested her hand gently near the broken pommel, her eyes filled with a quiet, knowing sorrow. If this weapon was truly nothing more than forgotten rust, why was an elite strike team rushing to lock down the vault? The heavy, reinforced titanium blast doors of the intake room did not just slide open. They slammed back into their hydraulic recesses with a violent hiss of escaping pressure. For heavily armed military police officers moved into the sterile space, their boots hitting the pristine linoleum in perfect, disciplined unison. They did not shout. They did not aim their rifles at the frail woman standing quietly by the table. Instead, they formed a tight, silent perimeter around the rusted sword, their eyes locked on the decaying metal as if it were a live explosive waiting to level the entire compound. Bradley stood frozen, his hand still hovering over the dropped electromagnetic tongs. He looked to the lead officer, a grizzled sergeant with a scar cutting through his graying eyebrow, expecting a command, an explanation, or at the very least, a scoff at the absurdity of the situation. But the sergeant's face was pale, pulled tight with a tension Bradley had only ever seen in combat footage. The secure communications unit on Bradley's desk hissed with static before the installation commander's voice broke through once more, the tone completely devoid of its usual military polish. He ordered Bradley to execute a Level 1 physical appraisal. No automated scanners. No deep penetration lasers. No digital uplinks. He was strictly instructed to use his own two hands, a simple piece of cloth, and a basic magnifying lens. To Bradley, this was an offensive request. It was a direct insult to his years of advanced technical training. He was a master of algorithms and synthetic diagnostics, a man who read the future in code, not a museum curator dusting off old bones. But the terrifying presence of the armed guards and the absolute silence of the old woman, Evelyn Carter, left him no choice. He swallowed hard, reaching into his supply drawer to retrieve a pair of heavy, insulated handling gloves and a small bottle of neutral, non-reactive cleaning solvent. He approached the velvet-lined table cautiously, as if the air around the sword had suddenly grown thick and heavy. As he reached out and wrapped his gloved hands around the weapon to shift it into the light, his breath hitched in his throat. The visual data his eyes were sending to his brain did not match the physical reality in his hands. The sword looked like a brittle, hollowed-out piece of oxidized scrap, the kind of crude iron that should flake away into orange dust at the slightest pressure. Yet, it weighed almost as much as a solid block of depleted uranium. The density was staggering. More than that, the balance was unervingly perfect. Despite the jagged, missing chunks along the blade and the cracked pommel, the center of gravity rested flawlessly right at the guard, as if the weapon were actively adapting to the grip of whoever held it. Bradley grabbed a simple microfiber cloth, applying a single drop of the clear solvent. He chose a spot near the base of the blade, right above the leather-wrapped hilt, where the encrusted dirt and rust seemed the thickest. He pressed the cloth against the metal and began to rub gently in a slow, circular motion. He fully expected the harsh, gritty sound of grinding rust. Instead, the cloth glided over the surface smoothly, as if slipping across a sheet of polished ice. And then, the machines began to scream. It started as a low, agonizing groan from the massive electromagnetic scanning archway dominating the center of the room. The billion-dollar sensor array, the undeniable pride of the military's technological superiority, began to violently vibrate. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered rapidly, casting chaotic, strobing shadows across the pale faces of the security team. Bradley dropped the cloth and stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs as the glowing monitors on his pristine workstation turned from a sea of black to a blinding, chaotic blizzard of white static. The ambient hum of the Department of Defense servers behind the blast glass pitched upward into a deafening, painful whine. Warning klaxons began to wail in the distance, echoing down the vast subterranean hallways of the Armory. If you are listening to this and you understand that the true history of our world is not stored in a fragile digital cloud, but forged in the quiet sacrifices and unspoken memories of the men and women who came before us, then you know that some secrets demand patience to uncover. For those of you who still respect the heavy weight of the past, keep listening, because what happened next in that room defies all modern logic. The automated systems were not just failing due to a glitch, they were being actively blinded. The ambient electromagnetic frequencies of the entire room were being violently pulled into the exposed patch of metal on the table, suffocating the high-tech equipment. Bradley, terrified but driven by an overwhelming, sudden curiosity that overpowered his fear, ignored the shrieking alarms. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old-fashioned jeweler's loupe, a simple manual magnifying glass he kept only as a novelty to mock the older engineers. He pressed the small lens to his eye, leaning in incredibly close to the spot he had just cleaned. The rust had not merely washed away. It had retracted. Beneath the layer of centuries-old grime, the metal was not iron, nor titanium, nor any alloy recorded in the vast, infinite databases of the United States military. It was a seamless, impossibly smooth surface layered with microscopic, overlapping hexagonal scales. It looked almost like the dark, metallic skin of a serpent, shimmering with an incredibly faint, internal amber glow. The metal was literally absorbing the kinetic energy of the failing room. Bradley felt a warm, rhythmic pulse radiating against his cheek, like a slow, sleeping heartbeat trapped within the steel. He gasped, falling backward onto the floor as the main servers behind him erupted in a shower of brilliant blue sparks, plunging the room into the deep, crimson glow of the emergency backup lights. In the dim red illumination, Evelyn Carter had not moved a single inch. She looked down at the young, terrified soldier on the floor, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the impossible metal. Bradley's entire modern world had just been completely dismantled by a single drop of solvent and a piece of cloth. What was this impossible material hiding beneath the rust? And what terrifying, glowing symbol was slowly illuminating itself on the blade, causing a billion-dollar security grid to completely self-destruct just by looking at it? The crimson emergency strobes painted the intake room in rhythmic flashes of blood and shadow, casting long, distorted silhouettes against the titanium walls. Bradley remained on the cold linoleum floor, his chest heaving as he gasped for the stale, metallic-tasting air. The absolute certainty of his digital world, the very foundation of his pride and arrogance, lay in smoking, pathetic ruins all around him. The massive server banks, which just minutes ago housed the sum total of modern tactical knowledge, hissed and spat, leaking highly toxic coolant onto the pristine floor. The billion-dollar electromagnetic scanning archway stood completely dead, drained of its immense power in a matter of seconds. And yet, the rusted, forgotten sword on the table was no longer just a piece of scrap. Where Bradley had wiped away the centuries of heavy grime, a symbol was slowly burning into existence. It was not carved into the metal. It was not etched with a high-powered laser, nor was it stamped by a heavy industrial press. As Bradley stared, completely mesmerized by the impossibility of it all, he realized the symbol was growing from within the microscopic hexagonal scales of the metal itself, radiating a deep, pulsing amber light. Sergeant Miller, the grizzled leader of the security detail, slowly lowered his assault rifle, his eyes locked on the glowing mark. It was an insignia, but absolutely nothing that existed in any modern, classified military database. It resembled an ancient, intricate compass rose, but it was interwoven with a complex, spiraling double helix that seemed to organically shift and change its geometry depending on the angle of the dim red light. Bradley pushed himself off the floor, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the edge of the velvet-lined table to steady his legs. He leaned in close, completely abandoning his shattered reliance on his computers, trusting only his naked human eyes. The craftsmanship of the glowing mark was utterly impossible by modern manufacturing standards. The edges of the symbol were perfectly smooth at a microscopic level, implying a creation process that did not use heat, friction, or blunt force. It was as if the unknown smith had simply commanded the iron atoms to rearrange themselves into a permanent, glowing state of perfection. Evelyn Carter watched him closely, her pale blue eyes reflecting the warm amber glow of the blade. In that quiet, terrifying moment, she saw the arrogance completely drain from the young specialist's face, replaced by a profound, deeply humbling terror. For his entire life, Bradley had firmly believed that modern humanity was at the absolute peak of its technological capability. He believed that the past was nothing but mud, crude iron, and blind luck. But staring at the impossible geometry of the glowing compass rose, the character of this young man shifted forever. He realized the terrifying truth. Whoever forged this ancient weapon possessed an understanding of physics, metallurgy, and energy absorption that made his state-of-the-art armory look like a collection of crude, pathetic stone tools. This was not a weapon meant to chop or stab. It was a localized energy sink, an engineered marvel explicitly designed to neutralize and absorb the very frequencies that powered modern warfare. Just then, the heavy blast doors hissed open manually, and Colonel Arthur Mitchell strode heavily into the room. The installation commander was a hardened, uncompromising veteran, a man who had commanded artillery battalions and overseen deeply classified drone strikes across the globe. But as he stepped into the crimson-lit room and laid eyes on the glowing artifact resting on the table, all the color instantly drained from his weathered, sun-beaten face. He did not bark an order for a digital readout. He did not demand a chemical analysis from his panicked technicians. He simply stared at the amber helix, his jaw tight, recognizing the impossible mark of an ancient organization that officially did not exist in any history book. But before the colonel could speak a single word, the reinforced concrete floor beneath their boots gave a violent, sickening shudder. A low, agonizing mechanical groan echoed through the vast, subterranean corridors of the military facility. Bradley spun toward his secondary, heavily shielded analog console in the corner of the room, the only piece of rudimentary equipment that had survived the massive electromagnetic purge. The small, heavy cathode ray screen flickered to life with a loud pop, vomiting lines of harsh green text at an impossible speed. But these were not standard Department of Defense diagnostic codes. They were ancient command line overrides, written in a stark, forgotten military syntax that Bradley had only ever read about in deactivated, classified Cold War archives. The military base was actively sealing itself. Across the entire compound, massive, multi-ton titanium bulkheads were sliding into place with deafening crashes, permanently locking down the vital ventilation shafts and sealing the heavy elevator columns. The external security cameras, usually scanning the high desert perimeter for outside threats, simultaneously and abruptly swiveled completely around. On Bradley's analog monitor, a terrifying mosaic of security feeds popped up. Every single camera on the base was now pointed inward, staring directly through the blast glass at the intake room, watching the sword. Absolute panic began to rise in the chest of the young specialist. He frantically hammered on the heavy, mechanical keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys as he desperately tried to reassert control over the base's automated defense grid. But the billion-dollar system was completely ignoring his top-tier security credentials. It was as if a dormant ghost had suddenly woken up inside the mainframe, an ancient, ruthless protocol triggered by the activation of the amber symbol on the blade. The rapidly scrolling green text on his screen suddenly stopped, wiping the monitor completely clean in the blink of an eye. A single, terrifying sentence blinked steadily in the exact center of the dark monitor. It read, "Guardian Protocol initiated, thermal containment sequence in T-14 minutes." Colonel Mitchell cursed loudly, grabbing the heavy radio on his shoulder, shouting desperate orders to his men outside to manually pry open the blast doors before the failsafes locked them in forever. But the radio only produced a harsh, rhythmic static that perfectly matched the pulsing, breathing glow of the ancient sword. The automated sentry turrets in the hallways outside could be heard cycling their heavy ammunition feeds, preparing to defend the vault with lethal force from anyone trying to enter or anyone trying to leave. They were trapped. The very advanced technology Bradley had worshipped his entire life had been instantly hijacked, turned completely against them by a rusted piece of metal and an ancient, unbreakable code. The massive oxygen recyclers overhead abruptly ground to a halt. The sudden silence in the room was deafening compared to the constant, comforting hum of the modern machines they had relied on just moments ago. Evelyn Carter finally broke the heavy, oppressive silence. She reached out slowly, her frail hand hovering just inches above the glowing symbol, the amber light warming her deeply lined, exhausted skin. "I tried to tell you," she whispered, her voice remaining perfectly steady despite the rising panic and shouting of the hardened soldiers around her. The men who carried this did not build systems to conquer. They built them to endure. And right now, this room thinks it is under attack. Bradley stared at the glowing red countdown clock that had just appeared on his screen, watching the precious minutes tick away, realizing that his entire understanding of the world had been a comforting, childish lie. With the oxygen rapidly thinning and the heavily armed, billion-dollar base quickly turning into a sealed, thermal incineration tomb, how could a young man who only understood modern machines possibly disarm a weapon that was older, smarter, and far more dangerous than anything in the entire military's arsenal? They say that true courage is not found in the absence of fear, but in the realization that something else is far more important than the terror in front of you. The air inside the heavily shielded intake room was growing incredibly thick, heavy, and hot. The automated climate control systems, normally humming with invisible precision, had been completely severed by the violent electromagnetic purge. With every shallow breath Bradley took, he could taste the bitter, metallic tang of fried circuits and melting copper wiring. The harsh, crimson glow of the emergency strobes washed over the terrified faces of the men in the room, casting long, desperate shadows against the impenetrable titanium walls. On the heavy glass screen of his analog monitor, the stark green numbers of the thermal containment countdown continued their merciless march backward. 10 minutes. 9 minutes. The base was preparing to incinerate the entire vault to ashes, an ancient, ruthless protocol designed to scorch the earth rather than let the glowing artifact fall into the wrong hands. Colonel Mitchell, a man who had commanded thousands of troops and orchestrated airstrikes from the safety of padded chairs in air-conditioned bunkers, was reduced to slamming his heavy fists against the unyielding seams of the blast doors. His voice was hoarse, shouting blind orders into a dead radio, his pristine uniform soaked in sweat. The hardened military police officers paced the room like trapped wolves, their assault rifles completely useless against the crushing weight of the subterranean tomb. But Bradley Vance did not move from his desk. He stared at his trembling hands. The hands of a prodigy, a master of the digital age, now completely paralyzed. Every algorithm he had ever memorized, every piece of advanced diagnostic software he had worshipped, was utterly meaningless. He was a blind man suddenly thrown into the deep ocean. But as the countdown reached the 7-minute mark, the agonizing silence of the room was shattered. It was not the sound of the base's automated systems coming back online. It was a heavy, rhythmic, mechanical thud echoing through the solid steel of the blast doors. Someone was on the outside. Colonel Mitchell stepped back, his hand dropping to his sidearm, a sudden spark of hope igniting in his eyes. He shouted for the rescue team to hurry, warning them of the thermal purge. But Evelyn Carter, standing perfectly still beside the glowing sword, gently shook her head. Her voice, quiet but carrying an impossible weight, cut through the panic. "That is not a rescue," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the heavy seams of the door. "That is the consequence of arrogance. They have come to take it in the dark." Before Colonel Mitchell could ask what she meant, the titanium doors shuddered violently. A blinding shower of white-hot sparks erupted from the locking mechanism. The intruders were not using electronic keycards or digital overrides. They were using massive, chemically driven thermite charges to melt straight through the billion-dollar locking pins. With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the heavy doors were forcefully ripped apart by heavy hydraulic rams. Through the thick, billowing smoke of the melted titanium, a squad of heavily armored figures stepped into the crimson light of the intake room. They wore completely unmarked, matte black tactical gear that seemed to swallow the ambient light. They did not carry standard-issue digital optics, laser sights, or night vision goggles. Their faces were obscured by thick, crude, lead-lined rebreathers, and they wielded heavy, pneumatic, kinetic projectile weapons, completely analog rifles designed to function in a total electronic dead zone. This was a ghost unit, a shadow retrieval team operating completely outside the bounds of the established military hierarchy. They knew exactly what the sword was capable of, and they had come prepared to operate in the dark. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, barking an order, demanding their unit designation and commanding them to stand down. The leader of the Shadow Squad did not even acknowledge the colonel's existence. He simply raised his heavy pneumatic rifle and struck the veteran commander across the jaw with a heavy iron stock, sending Mitchell crashing to the floor in a heap. The rest of the squad fanned out with ruthless, silent efficiency, aiming their heavy weapons at the terrified military police officers, completely neutralizing the room in seconds. The leader, a massive, faceless silhouette wrapped in heavy armor, turned his attention directly to the velvet-lined table. He stepped over the scattered debris, his heavy boots crushing the remains of Bradley's shattered diagnostic tools. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a heavy, lead-lined containment cylinder, preparing to swallow the glowing weapon and leave the rest of them to burn in the impending thermal purge. Bradley Vance, the young man who had laughed at the rusted iron just an hour ago, felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of fury. It was not the calculated, logical anger of a technician finding a flaw in his system. It was something deeper, something primal. He looked at the glowing amber symbol pulsing on the blade, and then he looked at Evelyn, the frail, elderly woman who had carried this impossible burden alone. Without thinking, without calculating the odds of survival or running a digital simulation of the outcome, Bradley stepped directly into the path of the massive, armored operative. He stood between the shadow leader and the table, his hands empty, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was terrified, but for the first time in his life, he was not hiding behind a screen. "You cannot take it," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking, yet holding a desperate resolve. "The base is locked down. If you move that object without disabling the protocol, the thermal purge will incinerate this entire mountain. You will die with us." The faceless leader stopped. A slow, mechanical hiss escaped his rebreather. He raised the heavy, pneumatic rifle, pressing the cold steel barrel directly against Bradley's chest. The operative did not care about the purge. They were zealots of a hidden order, willing to sacrifice an entire military installation to secure the ultimate countermeasure against the digital age. Bradley closed his eyes, bracing for the fatal impact, realizing with profound clarity that honor and sacrifice were not outdated concepts written in dusty history books. They were the only things that actually mattered when the machines finally failed. But the shot never came. Evelyn Carter stepped out from the shadows, her hand moving with a speed and grace that defied her fragile appearance. She reached past Bradley and closed her bare, trembling hand directly around the cracked, petrified leather hilt of the sword. The moment her skin made contact with the weapon, the amber glow pulsating beneath the rusted scales did not just brighten, it erupted. A blinding, golden shockwave ripped through the confined space of the intake room. It was not a destructive blast of heat or kinetic force, but a profound, heavy wave of pure, concentrated atmospheric pressure that tasted like a thunderstorm. The shadow operative was thrown backward, his heavy analog rifle flying from his grip as he crashed into the far wall. The tactical squad collapsed to their knees, clutching their helmets, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming resonance of the golden light. Evelyn stood tall, the oppressive frailty of her age seemingly vanishing in the radiant glow of the weapon. She lifted the heavy iron blade effortlessly, pointing the glowing compass rose directly at the armored intruders. "You fools," she said, her voice echoing with the resonance of a massive, empty cathedral. "You come into the dark thinking you can steal the light. You think this blade was forged to conquer, to be locked away in your pathetic vaults as a weapon of ultimate destruction." She turned her gaze to Bradley, who was staring up at her in absolute awe. "Look at it, Bradley. Look at the truth. This was not built to end lives. It was forged to protect them from men like you." She drove the shattered pommel of the sword down hard onto the titanium table. The impact rang out like a massive, ringing church bell. The deep amber light surged from the blade, flowing out like a liquid electrical current, racing across the linoleum floor and directly into the fried, smoking servers of the mainframe. But it did not destroy them. It purged the ghost in the machine. On Bradley's analog monitor, the deadly red countdown abruptly froze at exactly 60 seconds. The numbers flickered, turned a soft, calming blue, and then simply vanished. The heavy titanium blast doors, which had threatened to seal them in an incinerator, let out a massive pneumatic sigh, the locking pins retracting into the walls. The automated sentry turrets in the hallways powered down with a low whine. The sword had not triggered the base's lethal defenses to destroy them. It had triggered the lockdown to protect itself from the shadow unit that had just breached the door. And now, recognizing Evelyn's protective touch, it released its grip on the base. The shadow operatives, realizing their total defeat and the sudden restoration of the base's external communications, scrambled to their feet. Without a single word, they dragged their injured leader and fled back through the smoke-filled breach, disappearing into the dark corridors before Colonel Mitchell's reinforcements could arrive. The crimson emergency lights faded, replaced by the soft, steady hum of the backup generators bathing the room in a pale, normal light. The sword on the table slowly dimmed. The brilliant golden compass rose fading back into a faint, sleeping amber pulse beneath the dark iron scales. Evelyn Carter swayed, the tremendous energy leaving her body, and Bradley rushed forward, catching her before she could fall. He guided her gently into his office chair, his hands shaking, no longer looking at her as an annoying civilian, but as a guardian of a truth he could barely comprehend. Colonel Mitchell slowly picked himself off the floor, staring at the ruined vault and the quiet, rusted sword on the table. The entire concept of modern warfare had just been rewritten in front of his eyes. But as Bradley leaned over the table to inspect the blade, he noticed something impossible. The massive surge of energy had caused the heavy, petrified leather wrapping around the hilt to split completely open. And resting inside the hollowed-out grip of this ancient, impossible relic was a small, perfectly preserved item that did not belong to the distant past. It was a metal dog tag, a standard issue, mid-20th century military dog tag, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, bearing a name that would force Bradley to uncover the greatest covered-up mission in human history. Whose name was stamped into that piece of metal? And how on earth did a modern soldier's identity become sealed inside an ancient, world-breaking artifact? The sterile, white fluorescent lights of the intake room flickered and finally stabilized, casting a cold, ordinary glare over a space that had just witnessed the impossible. The smell of scorched ozone and melted titanium hung heavy in the air, a bitter reminder of the raw, suffocating power that had just been unleashed and then peacefully subdued. Colonel Mitchell stood motionless, his highly decorated chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. He looked at the heavy, reinforced blast doors, permanently scarred by the Shadow Unit's thermite charges, and then he looked back at the velvet-lined table. He did not issue any orders to pursue the fleeing operatives. He did not bark into his radio for lockdown overrides. The hardened veteran simply reached up, slowly removed his service cap, and stood in absolute, humbled silence. At the center of the room, Evelyn Carter carefully folded the tattered, oil-stained canvas tarp back over the rusted iron of the ancient sword. The deep, pulsating amber glow of the compass rose had completely retreated beneath the blackened, hexagonal scales, returning the weapon to its dormant, unassuming state. It looked like scrap metal once again, but no one in that room would ever dare to laugh at it. As Evelyn wrapped the heavy iron, her frail hands moved with a quiet, solemn finality. She was taking it back into the dark. Colonel Mitchell made no move to stop her. The United States military had just learned a profound and terrifying lesson. There are forces on this earth that cannot be classified, contained, or controlled by microchips and satellite surveillance. To attempt to cage the weapon was to invite destruction. The safest place for the artifact was exactly where it had been for decades, in the quiet, trembling hands of a faithful guardian. But as Evelyn lifted the heavy, wrapped bundle from the table, she left something behind. Resting on the bruised velvet, gleaming under the harsh modern lights, was the small, stamped piece of dull silver metal that had fallen from the shattered leather hilt. Bradley Vance, his hands still trembling from the golden shockwave, stepped slowly toward the table. He reached out and picked up the metal tag by its beaded chain. It was cold, incredibly light compared to the crushing weight of the sword, yet it felt as though it held the gravity of an entire planet. He rubbed his thumb over the deeply stamped, mid-20th century lettering, fully expecting to read the name of a forgotten, ancient warrior or a highly classified shadow operative. Instead, his blood ran completely cold, and the breath caught violently in his throat. The tag read, Vance, William H. It was his grandfather. Bradley's mind forcefully violently against the impossible reality of the stamped letters. William Harrison Vance was not a shadow operative. He was not a guardian of ancient, world-breaking artifacts. To Bradley, his grandfather had simply been a quiet, gentle man who smelled of motor oil and pipe tobacco. He was a man who had spent his entire post-war life running a small, dusty auto repair shop in Ohio. A man who built birdhouses on the weekends and never, ever spoke about his time in the European theater. The family narrative, the official military record that Bradley himself had proudly looked up in the digital archives years ago, stated clearly that Private First Class William Vance had been a simple motor pool mechanic. He was supposed to have spent the war fixing broken axles on transport trucks, miles behind the front lines, safely away from the brutal, muddy reality of combat. How could the identity tag of a humble, grease-stained mechanic be permanently sealed inside the hilt of a weapon that possessed the power to cripple a billion-dollar, state-of-the-art military fortress? Evelyn Carter paused at the threshold of the ruined blast doors. She did not turn around, but her voice carried softly over the hum of the recovering generators. The greatest shields this world has ever known, she whispered, were not forged by generals or kings. They were carried by ordinary men who knew how to keep a secret, and who understood that some victories can never be written in the history books. With that, she stepped out into the corridor and simply faded into the chaotic aftermath of the base, taking the impossible weapon with her, leaving Bradley standing alone in the ruins of his former arrogance. The following 48 hours were a blur of intense, classified recovery operations. The Department of Defense quietly scrubbed the digital logs of the Fort Harrison anomaly, blaming the massive server failure and the melted blast doors on a catastrophic, localized seismic event and a simultaneous cooling system malfunction. The official narrative was rewritten before the smoke even cleared. But Bradley Vance was no longer interested in the official narrative. He was no longer the arrogant, digital prodigy who trusted only what a computer screen could verify. His entire worldview had been shattered, rebuilt by the heavy, undeniable truth resting in his pocket. He needed to know who his grandfather truly was, and what he had done in the dark, frozen forests of Europe to earn the right to seal his name inside that blade. For the first time in his career, Bradley completely bypassed his state-of-the-art workstation. He knew the digital archives had been sanitized. They would only tell him the comfortable lies he had already believed. Instead, he took the long, echoing elevator ride down into the deepest, most neglected sub-basements of the military annex. This was the realm of the forgotten past. A sprawling, poorly lit labyrinth of dusty cardboard boxes, rusted filing cabinets, and miles of decaying paper records that the military had deemed too insignificant to digitize. The air down there smelled of old glue, decaying binding thread, and the heavy, quiet dust of dead men. He moved past the rows of neatly categorized infantry movements and supply manifests, searching for the anomaly. He spent hours huddled over a flickering, analog microfiche reader, the harsh yellow light illuminating endless, scrolling reels of mid-century bureaucratic noise. His eyes burned, his back ached, but the memory of the golden shockwave drove him forward. If William Vance had not been in the motor pool, where was he? It was near 3 in the morning when he finally found the first tear in the fabric of the lie. It was not a grand, heavily stamped classified document. It was a simple, easily overlooked logistical error. A requisition form, dated December of 1944, requesting specialized, heavy-duty canvas, lead-line transport containers, and a significant amount of industrial-grade thermite. The items were being shipped to a location in the Ardennes forest that officially did not hold any Allied troops at the time. The signature authorizing the transfer belonged to a unit that did not exist on any standard order of battle, the 412th Technical Recovery Group, and listed at the very bottom of the manifest, assigned as the primary transport specialist, was Private First Class William H. Vance. Bradley's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He cross-referenced the 412th across thousands of pages of deeply buried analog transfer logs. He discovered that this unit had no fixed barracks. They had no official commendations. They moved like ghosts behind the shifting front lines of the war, appearing only in the margins of other units' reports, usually in the aftermath of strange, unexplained phenomena, sudden, violent electrical storms that knocked out entire German armored columns, or localized communication blackouts that saved trapped Allied battalions. His grandfather was not fixing trucks. He was a driver for a unit tasked with hunting down, securing, and hiding anomalous wartime technology. He was the man responsible for getting the impossible artifacts out of the war zone before the enemy, where even their own ambitious generals could weaponize them. Bradley stared at the yellowed paper, tracing his grandfather's faded signature with a trembling finger. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. The simple mechanic from Ohio had been part of a shadow war, carrying burdens that defied physics and logic. But the paper trail abruptly ended in late January of 1945. The entire 412th Technical Recovery Group was quietly disbanded on paper, their records sealed, their members scattered back to mundane assignments like the motor pool to live out their lives in absolute, enforced silence. The files could only tell Bradley where his grandfather had been, but they could not tell him what had happened on the night the sword was recovered, or why his grandfather's dog tag had been chosen as the ultimate seal. Papers could only hold the ink. They could not hold the memory. He needed a voice. He needed someone who had been there in the freezing mud, someone who had stood beside William Vance when the sky burned and the machines failed. Bradley scoured the final disbandment roster of the 412th. Almost all the names were accompanied by a small, black cross, indicating they had long since passed away, taking their massive secrets to the grave. But near the very top of the faded page, the name of the commanding officer remained completely unmarked. A man who, against all odds, was still alive, quietly residing in a heavily guarded, private veteran sanatorium in the remote hills of Virginia. General Robert McMillan. Bradley leaned back in the hard wooden chair, the harsh light of the microfiche reader illuminating the profound determination on his face. The military had spent billions trying to understand the weapons of the future, completely ignoring the terrifying, impossible power locked away in the past. To uncover the ultimate truth about his family's legacy and the true purpose of the ancient sword, Bradley knew he had to leave the safety of the archives. He had to travel to Virginia, bypass the government minders, and look an ancient, forgotten general in the eye. But as he packed his bag, staring at his grandfather's dog tag resting in his palm, a chilling question echoed in the quiet basement. What terrifying, world-ending secret was General McMillan keeping? And would the old man be willing to speak the truth before the Shadow Unit realized Bradley was finally coming for the answers? The drive through the winding, fog-draped roads of the Shenandoah Valley felt like descending into another century. Pinecrest Manor was supposed to be a quiet, dignified retirement facility for high-ranking military officers, but the heavy wrought iron gates and the silent, broad-shouldered orderlies standing near the entrance told a very different story. It was a holding pen for men who knew entirely too much to be allowed to wander among the civilian population. Bradley did not wear his uniform. He dressed in simple civilian clothes, adopting the quiet, unassuming posture of a visiting grandson to slip past the front desk during the busy morning shift change. He navigated the sanitized, floral-carpeted hallways until he reached a heavy oak door at the very end of the restricted wing. Room 412. The number alone sent a cold shiver down his spine. He pushed the door open to find a room bathed in the muted light of an overcast morning. Sitting in a high-backed leather wheelchair, facing a large window that looked out over the rolling, forested hills, was General Robert McMillan. He was a man whittled down by time, his skin thin and spotted, his shoulders severely stooped beneath a thick wool blanket. But when the old man slowly turned his head at the sound of the door clicking shut, his eyes were sharp, clear, and utterly terrifying. They were the eyes of a predator that had simply grown tired of the hunt, not a man losing his mind to age. Bradley stood frozen just inside the doorway. He reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out the dull silver dog tag, holding it up by the beaded chain so it caught the gray light from the window. The old general did not gasp. He did not ask for an explanation. A slow, incredibly heavy sigh escaped his lungs, and he gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "You have his jawline," McMillan rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves dragged across cracked pavement, "and his stubborn, foolish posture. I told William that sealing his identity inside that rusted piece of hell was a mistake. I told him that one day, the iron would spit it back out, and someone would come looking for the ghost of the 412th. McMillan gestured with a frail, trembling hand toward a wooden chair beside him. "Sit down, boy." The men in the black armor. They missed it, did they not? They tried to take the light by force, and the old girl threw them against the wall. Bradley slowly sat down, absolutely stunned that this elderly man in a remote Virginia facility already knew exactly what had transpired in the subterranean vault of Fort Harrison. McMillan leaned forward, the blanket slipping from his shoulders, the commanding presence of a four-star general suddenly returning to his frail frame. He told Bradley that the history books lied about the winter of 1944. They talk about the bitter cold, the freezing mud of the Ardennes, and the overwhelming enemy artillery. But they never mention the absolute, terrifying silence. They never mention the nights when the compasses spun violently in circles and the radios screamed with the sound of 1,000 dead voices. The desperate, crumbling enemy command had unearthed something buried deep beneath the Black Forest. An engine. A massive, horrifying piece of ancient engineering design to completely sever the electromagnetic bonds of the Earth itself. They were going to activate it in the center of the Allied lines, vaporizing the communication grid and plunging the entire European theater into a localized, permanent dark age. McMillan's voice grew tighter, carrying the heavy weight of an 8-decade-old nightmare. We were bleeding out in the snow. My men were terrified, completely blind in the dark. But your grandfather, Private Vance, he was not carrying a rifle that night. He was carrying a heavy, oil-stained canvas tarp. The general closed his eyes, his breathing growing shallow as he narrated the impossible memory. "We found that sword a month earlier, buried beneath a bombed-out cathedral in France. We did not know what it was, only that it made our Jeep engines die whenever we got within 50 feet of it. But William, he understood it. He was a mechanic, a man who listened to how things hummed. He said the sword was not a weapon. It was a grounding rod, a tuning fork for the earth itself. As the catastrophic enemy engine began to power up, tearing the sky apart with agonizing streaks of silent, violet lightning, William Vance did not retreat with the rest of the battalion. He ran directly into the center of the anomaly. McMillan described watching Bradley's grandfather standing alone in the freezing mud, pulling the rusted, ancient sword from its canvas sheath. When the massive wave of destructive energy erupted from the tree line, it did not wash over the Allied troops. It was violently pulled into the iron blade. The heavy hexagonal scales beneath the rust ignited with a blinding, golden fire, absorbing a blast that should have leveled a mountain range. William stood his ground, the immense heat searing his hands, the terrifying resonance threatening to shatter his bones, until the enemy engine overloaded and tore itself completely apart. He saved tens of thousands of lives that night, McMillan whispered, a single tear cutting a path through the deep wrinkles of his weathered cheek. But he broke the hilt of the sword doing it. And he knew that if the high command found out what that chunk of iron could really do, they would never stop trying to replicate it. They would build bombs around it. They would turn a shield into a sword. So, William Vance made a choice. In the chaotic aftermath of the blast, before the regular infantry moved up, he shoved his own dog tag deep into the split, petrified leather of the hilt, binding his own life's energy, his own quiet, humble soul, to the dormant power of the weapon. He made it so the blade would only ever respond to a protector and would violently reject anyone trying to conquer with it. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Bradley looked down at the silver tag in his hand, the metal now feeling warm against his skin. His grandfather, the quiet man who built birdhouses and smelled of motor oil, was a titan who had quietly bent the arc of history and then simply walked away to live a completely ordinary life. McMillan reached out and gently tapped his trembling finger against the heavy wooden armrest of his wheelchair. He told Bradley that there was a false bottom in the drawer of the bedside table. For 80 years, the general had guarded a sealed envelope, a letter written by William Vance on the ship ride back home across the Atlantic, addressed to whoever finally pulled his name from the iron. Bradley stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He walked over to the small, mahogany nightstand, pressing his fingers under the drawer lining. He felt the sharp edge of paper and pulled out a yellowed, wax-sealed envelope. As he broke the brittle red wax and unfolded the fragile paper, he realized that the story of the 412th was not just a historical tragedy to be mourned. The letter contained a final, terrifying set of instructions. What did William Vance write in those fading lines of ink? And what incredibly dangerous journey was he now commanding his grandson to undertake to ensure the dark armor never returned to claim the light? The brittle, yellowed parchment felt unnervingly fragile in Bradley's hands, as if the slightest sudden movement might turn the 80-year-old memory to dust. He stood in the quiet, dim room of the sanatorium, the heavy silence broken only by the shallow, rattling breaths of General McMillan behind him. The red wax seal crumbled onto the floor, a tiny crimson testament to the decades of enforced silence. As Bradley unfolded the single, densely written page, he recognized the sharp, meticulous handwriting instantly. It was the exact same script that had carefully labeled the jars of nuts and bolts in his grandfather's dusty auto repair shop in Ohio. But the words written on this page were not about carburetor adjustments or tire pressures. They were the last will and testament of a man who had held the weight of the world in his bare hands. The ink was fading, transitioning from a stark black to a bruised, ghostly purple, but the voice of William Harrison Vance spoke clearly from the past. To the one who finally pulls my name from the iron, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means the rust has finally failed to hide the truth, and the men who prefer to operate in the dark have returned to claim the light. I am writing this on a transport ship, watching the gray waters of the Atlantic, knowing that the war we fought is over, but the war for this artifact has only just begun. Bradley's eyes traced the elegant, sloping letters, his heart aching with a profound, retrospective grief. His grandfather had spent his entire life deliberately cultivating an aura of absolute, unremarkable normality, all to ensure that no one would ever look too closely at the Vance family tree. "They will tell you it is a weapon," the letter continued. "The generals, the scientists, the men in black armor. They will try to plug it in, harness it, and use it to blind their enemies. But you must understand what I learned in the freezing mud of the Ardennes. The sword is not a tool of conquest. It is an anchor. It was forged centuries ago to ground the catastrophic energies of human arrogance." William's letter detailed the agonizing choice he had made in the aftermath of the blast. He knew that if he handed the weapon over to his own commanders, the cycle of destruction would simply escalate. The military would lock it in a vault, study it, and eventually build a machine capable of tearing the sky apart. So, he sabotaged the recovery. He snapped his own dog tag, wedged it into the shattered hilt, and bound his own quiet, humble signature to the ancient iron, effectively short-circuiting its aggressive capabilities. He turned it into a heavy, useless lump of scrap for anyone who did not share his bloodline or his absolute refusal to use it for harm. "I have carried this secret for a lifetime," the letter concluded, the handwriting growing slightly unsteady near the bottom of the page. "But my time is passing. If my tag has fallen, the binding is loose. You must not let them put it back in a cage. There is a place, a forgotten sanctuary where we originally pulled it from the earth, beneath the ruined foundations of a monastery in the Bavarian Alps. It must be returned to the deep rock, where the iron can sleep and the ambient energy of the earth can keep it dormant. Do not trust the men with the machines. Trust the silence." Bradley slowly lowered the letter. The profound weight of his inheritance settled squarely onto his shoulders. He was no longer just a digital technician. He was the sole heir to a legacy of quiet, monumental sacrifice. General McMillan gave a slow, solemn nod from his wheelchair, acknowledging the transfer of the burden. But as Bradley carefully folded the letter and placed it into his breast pocket, a terrifying realization washed over him. Evelyn Carter had vanished with the sword to keep it safe from the shadow operatives, but she did not know about the sanctuary in Bavaria. If Bradley was to fulfill his grandfather's dying wish, he had to find Evelyn before the shadow unit hunted her down. Where could an elderly woman possibly hide a world-breaking artifact from an invisible army? And how could a young man armed with nothing but a rusted dog tag and a fading letter protect her when the time for running finally ran out? Bradley left the quiet room of the sanatorium with a profound sense of clarity he had never once experienced while staring at a glowing computer screen. When he climbed back into his vehicle, he did something that the Bradley Vance from 48 hours ago would have considered absolute, unforgivable madness. He reached into his pocket, took his highly encrypted, state-of-the-art military smartphone, completely powered it down, and tossed it into the dark depths of the glove compartment. If the shadow unit was monitoring the digital grid, his phone was nothing more than a lethal tracking beacon. To find Evelyn Carter, and to protect the ancient iron she carried, he knew he had to operate entirely in the forgotten, analog world. He had to think exactly like his grandfather. He stopped at a dimly lit, run-down gas station on the edge of the county line and purchased a physical paper map. He traced the winding routes with a ballpoint pen, relying on memory, human intuition, and the heavy burden of duty, rather than the cold comfort of satellite navigation. He remembered the faded, brittle paper pass Evelyn had used to bypass the automated perimeter at Fort Harrison. The billion-dollar laser scanners had barely recognized it, but Bradley recalled the faint, blue ink stamp of a decommissioned naval shipyard located on the eastern seaboard. It was a thread, a tiny physical clue left behind in the real world. He drove through the quiet night, the rhythmic, analog hum of the highway tires replacing the frantic, high-pitched whine of the server rooms he used to worship. When he finally reached the rusted, salt-stained gates of the old shipyard the next morning, he found not a bustling military installation, but a quiet, forgotten coastal town. It was a place where the widows of the mid-century shipyard workers still lived in small, weather-beaten cottages, their lives moving at the slow, deliberate pace of the tides. He found Evelyn sitting on the wooden porch of a home that overlooked the gray, churning waters of the Atlantic. She did not look the least bit surprised to see him walking up her driveway. Resting beside her wooden rocking chair, wrapped once again in the heavy, oil-stained canvas tarp, was the terrifying burden of the 412th. She saw the deep exhaustion in Bradley's eyes, but more importantly, she saw the profound transformation. The arrogant, dismissive young technician who had laughed at the rusted iron was entirely gone. In his place stood a man who finally understood the crushing, invisible weight of history. When Bradley silently pulled his grandfather's silver dog tag from his pocket, the metal catching the pale morning light, Evelyn simply nodded. A sad, knowing smile crossed her deeply lined face. She told him that she was the daughter of the unit's original archivist, sworn by her own bloodline to hold the artifact in the dark until the grandson of the man who sealed it finally came to claim it. If you find yourself moved by these forgotten stories of quiet, analog courage, and you believe that the greatest heroes are often the ones who never asked for a medal or a parade, take a moment to join our community right now. Subscribe and stay with us, because the true test of this young soldier's resolve was only just beginning. Getting a highly anomalous, world-breaking artifact across the Atlantic Ocean without triggering every digital security sensor on the eastern seaboard required a masterpiece of logistical deception. Bradley knew he could not requisition a military transport, and he certainly could not book a commercial flight. The heavy iron would instantly short-circuit any modern aviation scanning equipment, bringing heavily armed federal agents down upon them in minutes. Instead, he relied on the fading, hidden network his grandfather had hinted at in the letter. Evelyn directed him to a retired cargo pilot, an old friend of her late father's, who operated a battered, analog-gauge freight plane out of a private, unmonitored grass airstrip hidden deep in the rural farmlands. They loaded the heavy canvas bundle into the freezing, unpressurized cargo hold, taking to the skies under the dark cover of a heavy storm system that completely blinded the regional radar towers. The long, freezing flight across the dark ocean was a grueling, physical test of endurance. Bradley sat wrapped in heavy wool blankets, his breath pluming in the freezing air, shivering right next to the ancient weapon. Without the constant, addictive distraction of digital notifications and scrolling screens, his mind was forced to dwell on the profound, heavy silence of the journey. He thought about the thousands of young men who had crossed this exact ocean 80 years ago, packed shoulder to shoulder into cramped transport ships, heading toward the freezing mud of a continent on fire. He was retracing their terrifying steps, not to fight a global war, but to finally bury the ghost of one. He was returning the ultimate countermeasure to the deep earth, ensuring that the sheer arrogance of modern warfare could never weaponize it and bring about the end of the digital age. When the battered cargo plane finally touched down with a heavy thud on a rain-slicked, remote airstrip nestled deep within the towering, jagged peaks of the Bavarian Alps, Bradley felt a sudden, massive wave of relief wash over him. They had actually made it. They had successfully slipped through the cracks of the modern, omnipotent digital surveillance state. The ancient sanctuary his grandfather had described, the ruined, subterranean foundations of a forgotten monastery, was only a few miles up the treacherous mountain pass. He helped Evelyn carefully step down from the aircraft, pulling the heavy canvas bundle onto a rusted, squeaking cargo trolley. The cold, crisp mountain air smelled of pine and wet stone, exactly as the yellowed letter had promised. But as they pushed the heavy trolley toward the edge of the cracked tarmac, the thick morning fog suddenly illuminated with the harsh, sweeping beams of high-intensity halogen headlights. A convoy of 3 heavily armored, immaculate diplomatic vehicles rolled silently out of the mist, perfectly blocking the only exit from the airstrip. These were not the unmarked, matte-black trucks of the Rogue Shadow unit. These vehicles bore the official, highly visible gold crests of the International Defense Coalition. The heavy doors opened in unison, and a line of high-ranking, heavily decorated military officials stepped out into the freezing rain. They were accompanied by an older man wearing a sharp suit, a man Bradley recognized instantly from the deepest classified archives. It was the Supreme Director of the Allied Historical Commission. They had not slipped through the cracks at all. The highest, most powerful levels of the global military establishment were actively waiting for them. Why had the ultimate authorities allowed a rogue soldier and an elderly woman to transport the world's most dangerous artifact across the globe entirely unimpeded? And what terrifying truth were they about to reveal on that freezing mountain tarmac? The freezing rain of the Bavarian Alps stung Bradley's face like tiny needles of glass. He instinctively stepped in front of Evelyn, planting his boots firmly on the cracked, weed-choked tarmac, putting his own body between the frail woman and the line of highly decorated military officials. He fully expected the sharp, metallic click of weapons being drawn. He braced himself for the harsh, booming voice of an officer reading him his rights, charging him with treason, desertion, and the absolute theft of the most classified artifact in human history. He was a rogue specialist who had completely bypassed military security and smuggled a weapon of mass destruction across international borders. In the cold, logical world he used to inhabit, his life was effectively over. But the Supreme Director of the Allied Historical Commission did not signal for armed guards to move forward. He was a tall, silver-haired man wearing a heavy wool trench coat over a pristine, dark suit. He stepped slowly away from the idling, armored diplomatic vehicles, his hands completely empty, resting calmly at his sides. He stopped a few paces from the rusted cargo trolley, completely ignoring the freezing rain that soaked his shoulders. The high-ranking generals and foreign dignitaries flanked him, their faces set in expressions of profound, heavy solemnity, not anger. "You have your grandfather's eyes, Specialist Vance," the director said, his voice carrying clearly over the howling mountain wind. It was not a threat. It was a quiet, astonishing statement of fact, and his absolute, terrifying stubbornness. "We did not track your digital footprint, Bradley. We knew exactly where you were going the moment General McMillan broke the wax seal on that letter in Virginia." Bradley stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the massive revelation. If the highest levels of the Global Defense Coalition knew about the letter and the sanctuary, why had they allowed a rogue shadow unit to breach Fort Harrison? Why had they let an old woman and a panicked technician smuggle a world-breaking anomaly in a freezing cargo plane? The director took another slow step forward, looking down at the heavy, oil-stained canvas tarp resting on the squeaking trolley. "The men who attacked your vault, the shadow unit, they were a splinter faction, a rogue element within our own intelligence apparatus who believed the old iron could be harnessed, weaponized, and used to dominate the digital grid. They were fools who only understood power, not consequence. But the true command, the ones who inherited the genuine legacy of the 412th, we knew the truth. We knew that if we tried to move the artifact ourselves, with our machines and our heavy armed escorts, the sword would interpret it as an act of war. It would have leveled the entire eastern seaboard before we even got it onto a transport ship." Evelyn Carter stepped out from behind Bradley, pulling her thin wool coat tighter against the biting cold. "You needed a Vance," she said, her voice steady and fiercely proud. "You needed the bloodline to carry it quietly in the dark." The director offered a slow, deeply respectful nod. William Harrison Vance bound his own life to that iron 80 years ago. He locked its destructive potential behind the simple, unbreakable seal of his own humble identity. Only his blood could touch the hilt without triggering the atmospheric purge. "We could not order you to do this, Bradley. A military order is an act of force, and the sword violently rejects force. You had to choose to carry the burden yourself. You had to walk away from your computers, your arrogance, and your pristine modern life, and actively accept the heavy, dirty truth of the past. If we had escorted you, the iron would have known. You had to make the journey exactly as your grandfather did, in the freezing dark, relying on absolutely nothing but honor and human intuition." The director turned slightly, gesturing to the line of elite, heavily decorated generals standing in the rain behind him. "For 80 years, the official history of this world has been a necessary, calculated lie. We built massive marble monuments to the generals who pushed the flags across the maps, and we buried the men who actually stopped the sky from catching fire. But today, the lion's here, on this mountain. Without a single spoken command, the Supreme Director and the entire line of international military officials snapped to attention. In the freezing, pouring rain of the remote Alpine airstrip, the highest-ranking leaders of the modern defense establishment raised their hands in a crisp, unified, and agonizingly slow salute. They were not saluting Bradley's rank as a young technician. They were not saluting Evelyn. They were saluting the rusted, oil-stained canvas bundle on the trolley and the impossible, quiet sacrifice of a motor pool mechanic from Ohio who had saved the world and never asked for a single word of thanks. The sheer emotional weight of the moment hit Bradley with the force of a physical blow. His throat tightened, and the freezing rain suddenly felt warm against his cheeks. He thought about his years sitting in the sterile, climate-controlled Armory, mocking the old equipment, blindly worshipping the flawless data on his screens. He had been completely blind to the profound human element of warfare. The absolute pinnacle of institutional power was now bowing to the forgotten mud of the past. The military had finally validated the impossible truth, officially recognizing the 412th Technical Recovery Group not as a clerical error, but as the silent saviors of the modern age. But as the director lowered his hand and motioned toward the jagged, fog-shrouded peaks towering above them, the atmosphere grew incredibly tense once more. He explained that their diplomatic authority, their armored vehicles, and their conventional weapons were completely useless past the tree line. The ruined monastery, the ancient deep rock sanctuary where the sword needed to be permanently grounded, was located at the very peak, accessible only by a crumbling, treacherous stone path. And the Splinter faction, the heavily armed rogue operatives who had survived the blast at Fort Harrison, had already reached the ruins. They were waiting in the dense fog, setting up a lethal perimeter to ambush the final transfer. How could Bradley, completely unarmed and physically exhausted, push through an elite squad of modern killers to finally bury the iron? And what final, shocking secret would the rusted blade reveal when it was finally returned to the ancient stone? The Supreme Director stepped back, folding his hands into the deep pockets of his heavy wool trench coat as the freezing alpine wind howled across the tarmac. He offered no weapons, no tactical earpieces, and no armored backup. Bradley Vance looked at the frail, exhausted face of Evelyn Carter, who gave him a single, trembling nod of encouragement. He reached down and wrapped his freezing fingers around the heavy, oil-stained canvas bundle on the rusted trolley. He hoisted the crushing weight of the ancient iron onto his shoulder, turned away from the idling diplomatic vehicles, and began the long, agonizing ascent alone. The path up the mountain was not a trail, but a treacherous, crumbling spine of jagged slate and slick, freezing mud. Every step was a battle against gravity and sheer physical exhaustion. Bradley's boots slipped on the wet stone, his lungs burning as the altitude stole the oxygen from the frigid air. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life sitting in ergonomically designed chairs, staring at glowing monitors in perfectly climate-controlled rooms. He had never known true, punishing physical labor. But as the freezing rain lashed against his face and the heavy iron dug ruthlessly into his shoulder, he did not stop. He thought of his grandfather, William Vance, standing in the freezing, bloody mud of the Ardennes, holding the line when the sky was tearing apart. Bradley realized that true strength had absolutely nothing to do with processing power or satellite uplinks. True strength was the quiet, stubborn refusal to let the dark inherit the earth. After nearly 2 hours of grueling, silent climbing, the dense, gray fog finally began to thin. Bradley breached the cloud line, his breath pluming in thick white clouds, and stepped onto the flattened summit of the jagged peak. Before him stood the ruined, skeletal remains of the forgotten monastery. Thick stone pillars, heavily choked with dark green moss and centuries of ice, loomed in the mist like the ribs of a decayed leviathan. At the very center of the open courtyard, surrounded by the crumbling walls, sat a massive, circular altar of solid, unhewn black bedrock. This was the grounding point. This was the silent sanctuary his grandfather had promised in the fading ink of his final letter. But Bradley was not alone. From the deep shadows of the ruined archways, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of tactical boots echoed across the wet stone. 6 heavily armored figures stepped into the pale morning light, completely blocking his path to the altar. It was the Rogue Shadow Unit. They still wore their matte black, unmarked gear and lead-lined rebreathers, having survived the shockwave at Fort Harrison and tracked the ultimate prize to the top of the world. The massive, faceless leader stepped forward, raising his heavy, pneumatic kinetic rifle and aiming it directly at Bradley's chest. The operative did not speak. He simply held out his left hand, demanding the canvas bundle. They still blindly believed they could chain the iron, drag it back to a hidden laboratory, and use it to hold the modern digital world hostage. Bradley stopped. He was completely unarmed, his muscles trembling from the grueling climb, completely surrounded by elite killers. But as he looked at the heavy, lethal weapons pointed at him, he did not feel the paralyzing, suffocating terror he had felt back in the subterranean vault. He felt a strange, profound calm. He reached up and slowly pulled the oil-stained canvas tarp away, letting it fall to the wet stone. The ancient sword lay exposed in his bare hands. The dark, hexagonal scales along the deeply pitted blade instantly reacted to the tense, violent atmosphere. The deep amber compass rose began to pulse, casting a warm, golden glow against the freezing alpine fog. The shadow operatives hesitated, instinctively taking a half-step back, remembering the devastating atmospheric pressure the weapon had unleashed in the armory. "You think this is a weapon," Bradley said, his voice ringing out clear and steady, carrying the exact same quiet, unyielding authority his grandfather had possessed. "You think you can take this down the mountain and plug it into your wars, but you cannot conquer with a shield, and you cannot steal what was meant to be buried." Before the shadow leader could pull the heavy mechanical trigger, Bradley moved. He did not swing the heavy iron at the armored men. He did not try to fight them. He turned his back on the leveled rifles, sprinted the final few yards toward the center of the courtyard, and drove the rusted, shattered hilt of the sword straight down into a deep, ancient fissure perfectly carved into the center of the black bedrock altar. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver dog tag bearing his grandfather's name, and slammed it directly into the cracked, petrified leather of the hilt, perfectly sealing the connection. The mountain did not explode. The sky did not tear open with violent lightning. Instead, a wave of absolute, terrifying silence violently expanded from the stone altar. It was a golden, heavy resonance that tasted like ozone and deep earth. The amber light flared with the brilliance of a dying sun, flooding the ruined monastery with a blinding, pure radiance. The shadow operatives fired their pneumatic weapons, but the kinetic projectiles simply stopped in midair, stripped of all their terrifying momentum, dropping harmlessly to the wet stone like dead leaves. The heavy, analog mechanisms of their rifles fused solid. The protective, lead-lined rebreathers they wore violently cracked and shattered. The ancient iron was aggressively purging the mountain of all human hostility, draining the very concept of warfare from the air itself. The operatives, stripped of their weapons, their armor compromised, and their absolute superiority completely erased, fell to their knees in the ruins. They were not physically harmed, but their will to fight had been entirely absorbed by the stone. As the blinding golden light slowly began to fade, Bradley stepped back from the altar. The deep amber glow within the hexagonal scales of the sword flickered one final time, and then completely vanished. The metal turned cold, dark, and utterly dormant. It was no longer a world-breaking artifact. It had fused completely with the bedrock, becoming an indistinguishable part of the ancient mountain, locked away forever by the quiet sacrifice of the Vance bloodline. When Bradley finally made the long descent back down to the airstrip, the freezing rain had stopped. The pale morning sun was just beginning to break through the heavy clouds, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley. Evelyn Carter was waiting for him by the rusted trolley, tears of profound relief streaming down her weathered face. The Supreme Director and his line of generals had already departed, leaving behind a single, unmarked vehicle with the keys and the ignition and a quiet, unspoken promise that the Vance family would never be hunted again. Bradley Vance did not return to the sterile, high-tech armory at Fort Harrison. He handed in his resignation to Colonel Mitchell the following week, leaving his state-of-the-art diagnostic screens and billion-dollar servers behind without a single look backward. He traded his pristine, fluorescent-lit world for a small, dusty auto repair shop in Ohio, perfectly preserving the quiet, oil-stained legacy of the man who had saved the world. Because Bradley finally understood that the most important things in life cannot be digitized, backed up, or saved on a server. They must be carried in the heart, guarded by memory, and passed down through the quiet stories we tell in the dark. If this journey through the forgotten shadows of history has reminded you of the quiet heroes in your own life, those who sacrificed everything without ever asking for recognition, please share this story with someone who still values the truth. Leave a comment below to honor the silent guardians of our past, and subscribe to ensure these vital, human memories are never lost to the cold machines of the future. Until next time, remember, steel forgets, but the human spirit remembers. In a cinematic, realistic style with photorealistic quality, a weathered mechanic named Jack stands in a dimly lit garage, kicking the flat tire of a rusty 1964 Chrysler Imperial with a dry, sarcastic laugh. A medium shot captures his action, followed by a close-up on his face as he delivers his dismissive line. "Ma'am, this isn't a car, it's a boat anchor," under the natural, somewhat grimy garage lighting, conveying a gritty and humorous mood. Continuing the cinematic realism, a wide shot in the bustling garage shows Jack gesturing dismissively at the dilapidated Chrysler Imperial, its rusty hulk evident under the bright, functional garage lighting. Other customers, a mix of blue-collar workers, laugh along with him, their shared amusement at the car's state palpable, with close-ups highlighting the extreme rust and wear, suggesting it's held together by luck alone. With professional cinematography, the scene shifts to Martha, an older woman, standing perfectly still and composed amidst the laughing men, her posture impeccable. A medium shot emphasizes her dignified presence, contrasting with the chaotic garage, while a close-up on her eyes reveals a sharp, unwavering gaze, as intense as a hawk's, her face softly illuminated by natural light, conveying a calm yet unyielding mood. In a cinematic, realistic style, Martha looks directly at Jack, her expression serious and wise, as she calmly but authoritatively states, "Your generation is addicted to screens, but you have forgotten how to read the metal." An over-the-shoulder shot from Jack's perspective captures her stern gaze, followed by a reverse shot showing Jack's slightly taken aback and confused reaction, with balanced natural light creating a slightly mysterious atmosphere. Maintaining photorealistic quality, Martha extends a hand to point at a specific, dusty spot on the car's doorpost, instructing Jack to wipe the dust off that doorpost and check the VIN. A close-up on her pointing hand transitions to a shot of the dusty doorpost, then to Jack's face, displaying a mix of confusion and skepticism, all under direct, clear lighting that highlights the intriguing detail. In film quality production, Jack smirks, a close-up capturing his confident, almost arrogant expression. He casts a dismissive glance at the old car, embodying years of experience as a vehicle identifier. A low-angle shot looking up at Jack, with the car subtly in the background, emphasizes his self-assuredness, illuminated by strong, slightly overhead light that defines his features. With cinematic realism, Jack, with a reluctant sigh, picks up a rag and begins scrubbing a small, grimy metal plate on the car's doorpost. A detailed close-up focuses on his hands, showing the effort as dust and grime slowly lift, gradually revealing faint, obscured numbers underneath, building a sense of anticipation under focused lighting that highlights the emerging details. In a moment of dawning realization, Jack's hand slows its scrubbing motion, his expression shifting from reluctance to surprise and confusion as he deciphers the revealed numbers. An extreme close-up on the unusual VIN prefix, XINT, fills the screen, followed by a shot of Jack's widening, bewildered eyes, clearly lit to emphasize the stark contrast with the surrounding dirt. With professional cinematography, Jack, now driven by intense curiosity, swiftly pulls out a modern tablet. A close-up captures his fingers rapidly typing the unique VIN into a search bar, the screen displaying a search interface. His focused face is illuminated by the tablet's glow, creating a sense of urgency and mystery against the garage's ambient light. In a dramatic, film-quality shot, the tablet screen, instead of displaying car information, suddenly flashes an alarming, bright red, with prominent text like "Access Denied" appearing. A close-up on the vibrant red screen fills the frame, followed by a quick cut to Jack's face, wide-eyed and startled, the red glow casting an ominous light upon him, escalating the tension. Maintaining cinematic realism, the bright red tablet screen still displays "Access Denied" and National Security Protocol 9. Jack slowly lifts his gaze from the tablet, his eyes finding Martha, his breathing shallow, and his expression tense with a rising sense of fear. A slow zoom out reveals Martha in the background, staring back, the persistent red light intensifying the atmosphere. In a visually striking, photorealistic scene, Jack stares intently at Martha, his face a complex mix of fear, confusion, and profound realization. Martha maintains her stoic, knowing expression. The camera subtly pans between their faces, highlighting the intense, unspoken tension between them, with the rusty car now an ominous, mysterious presence in the background, all bathed in dramatic lighting with deep shadows.